going to be a migrant worker. Yeah, we can go ahead.
Should we go ahead?
Yeah, and then she can join us.
Bet she's in the wrong place. Did the venue change for this one?
No. She had another meeting, but at 3 o'clock that ended 1 hour ago at Salve Doctorato.
Okay.
I saw her earlier at the Brufani, but that was about an hour and a half
So
ago.
breakfast. Yeah.
She's just knocking back.
No, she was just walking in, and she was very lucid. She was very lucid.
Yeah. I think we'll start. Renée is on her way, but I hope she's not going to be offended, but we're going to kick off.
Hey, if she doesn't get in, can you send one of the people who's waiting downstairs to get into the session? They can sit here and watch.
Yeah. So this is about growth, and I kind of personally think growth is actually kind of the big wicked challenge we're going to be facing. I think there's kind of deep-seated reasons and there's kind of more immediate reasons. I think the immediate reasons is actually COVID was a tricky thing, but one of the really surprising gifts, and I use that word in quotes clearly, is it actually delivered kind of surprising growth to a lot of organizations, which was very welcome. But that growth came from a set of truly exceptional circumstances. So organizations who want to kind of nail that growth or continue to grow, we're talking at a different set of levers. And I think the deeper issue, which is something that I'm kind of looking at going forward in my work, is essentially if you look at the kind of like 25-year trajectory in the media industry, if you take it kind of stability before digital, there was a kind of valley when we went through digital. Organizations have been executing a digital fix, some more successful than others. But when they come out the other side, you know, when the kind of digital transformation starts to get nailed, the problem is they come out at a lower place. I mean, in general, total digital revenues, once you've pulled off your digital transformation, are just lower and more volatile than the old established ones were. So I think what we're going to see as more and more organizations come out on the other side of digital transformation is there's going to be a big question mark. You know, if we have serious ambitions about our news, if we want to fund, you know, serious tech, have serious products, have a really big newsroom, we're going to have to get serious about growth. And so my sense is this is the challenge we're looking at, and I'm kind of pulled together a group of experts, all of whom have a kind of growth mandate, but a different kind of growth mandate. So I think what I'd like to do is get the panel to introduce themselves and actually explain what it is they're doing about growth. So what their growth challenge is. So let me kick off with Chris.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm Chris Moran from The Guardian. My job title is Head of Editorial Innovation, and I'm going to disappoint everyone by pointing out that I'm not actually in charge of growth anymore. But the reason I'm here is because I was the original audience editor at The Guardian. I created the audience function, and the processes. Is my mic on? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. So I'm Chris Moran from The Guardian. I'm the Head of Editorial Innovation. I started out as the first audience editor at The Guardian and built the audience function and the audience team, and I'm co-creator of The Guardian's real-time data tool called OFAN. My job has changed over that period of time. I've moved away from being the head of audience, but I still work with the head of audience to hold shared responsibility for the use of data in the newsroom in a responsible fashion. The way in which we build culture around numbers to make sure that they're supporting journalists rather than undermining their work or perverting the course of our journalism.
Right. So kind of a lot of your growth journey is actually the central engine is the data.
Yes. So, I mean, we think about data. OFAN is a real-time data tool, but it only happens to be a real-time data tool. It's a culture change tool. So when I first started, the reason that OFAN was created was because I had assumed that I could walk into a newsroom and explain to our journalists that if we wrote a headline that mentioned the topic, rather than use the print headline, which often didn't, we could suddenly open up new audiences. But actually, even though that's perfectly common sense, it was incredibly difficult to break down 200 years of habit, right? And you know, at that point, most organizations, even a very kind of progressive digital one like The Guardian, still thought of print as the kind of superior form. And so coming from a background that had nothing to do with numbers at all, I went to developers and I said, I think the thing that I need to persuade our journalists to change their mind is to be able to show them in real time exactly what the impact of that action was. And so, again, the seeds of OFAN are not, I didn't come into The Guardian and think, I love numbers and I must get data in the newsroom. That's a bad place to start. Instead, I had a very specific aim, and we used the data to support that aim and convince people. And for me, that's always where it's best used.
Right. Yasir, why growth? Why do you need
I thought you were
growth?
going to ask me, why are you here? Look, we have a very, so first, I'm Yasir Khan. I'm editor-in-chief of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I'm brand new in the job. I've only been in the job for 7 months, so whatever I say right now is probably subject to change in the next couple of days, couple of months, couple of weeks. So yeah, don't take it as anthem. But for us, growth is a bit similar to what Chris was talking about, and a bit different. We're a not-for-profit, and we're a non-profit newsroom competing with for-profit newsrooms. We are so for us, and we're very, very small compared to a newsroom like the Washington Post or the Guardian. And growth for us, it has less to do with volume than it has to do with loyalty. And I'll tell you where we are right now. We are currently a very newswire-focused newsroom. All of our output ends up on Thomson Reuters Newswire, and where we are going is, while maintaining that connection with the Thomson Reuters Newswire, we are moving towards becoming a more digital audience-focused newsroom. We've done our very first audience studies recently and figured out who's actually reading us, what are they coming to us for. We did something quite radical. We dropped all of our spot news output, which was daily news output, because we're connected to one of the most powerful daily news brands in the world. So we were competing against our own, mothership for no good reason. We dropped that. And what happened as a result is the time that people spend on our content has gone up, because we started finally getting to know what it is that people were coming to us for, and we learned that they were coming to us for depth and analysis and insight. And that is where I think we are going to make our mark in terms of growth. Is, I would much rather have 50,000 people, in a week reading for 5 minutes each than 500,000 people reading for 30 seconds and then just bouncing, right? So that is where I would like our newsroom to head. Our challenges, it's very comforting for me to know our challenges are not new and not unique. We have the exact same challenges as Chris does, which is a cultural shift in the newsroom where we are going from, journalists who are, for the last however many decades, used to writing for the Newswire and writing pieces that are everything to everybody that subscribers can take and use in their output, to having a quality of output that is very unique to us and having a tone of voice that is unique to us. And that is going to take time. Things like mentioning the topic in the headline is a huge, is a hurdle that I had miscalculated on as well. But, why wouldn't it make sense? But, there's all those years of habit to break. It's not wrong. It's just, imagine you'd been doing something for your entire career, and now you're being told, well, we don't do that anymore. And I totally get the terror that it strikes in the hearts of the best of us. But yeah, that's where we're headed. We're headed towards perhaps a smaller but a more loyal audience that reads for longer and consumes our content for a bit longer.
I think we're going to dig into that. Is all growth good growth?
Yeah.
But Robin, let's bring you in. You're looking at growth from a different angle, right? Different levers.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Hi, everybody. I'm Robin Kwong. I'm New Formats editor at the Wall Street Journal, and what that actually means is that I am in charge of 3 teams at the Wall Street Journal. They're newsletters, so all of our newsletters operations, and we publish around 30 odd newsletters, rankings, so the best US colleges, most popular Oscar movies, best airlines, worst airlines, and then finally audience voices, which is comment moderation of comments at the bottom of articles, and also This is much better, isn't it? Okay, really abridged version of what I just said without the mic on. Hi, everybody. I'm Robin. I'm new formats editor at the Wall Street Journal. I'm in charge of 3 teams: newsletters, rankings, and audience voices. And audience voices is comment moderation underneath articles, reader callouts, live Q&As, any sort of journalist-reader interaction. And so these 3 teams seem a little bit sort of disparate, a bit sort of random collection of 3 teams, but actually, and this relates to the growth question that Lucy was asking, what I'm really interested in exploring with these 3 is how do you use these 3 things, which operate in slightly different ways, to build reader habit and to build reader loyalty. Newsletters is fairly straightforward. You sign up for it. We are in your inbox on a regular basis, whether daily or weekly. Rankings, so anybody can just sort of open up a Word file or create a web page and say, here's what I think the 10 best whatever is, and call it a ranking. But the way that we approach ranking, and that would be a sort of, this is my opinion, and this is why I think this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But the way that we approach ranking is as a form of data journalism. So we do make some subjective decisions about what counts as the criteria, but you as a reader will be able to see exactly where the data sources come from, where the methodology is, what we have done to normalize some of the scores or make sort of adjustments to the data, and this is why we ended up with this particular ranking. And so our approach to rankings is that these should be information resources that relate to big decisions, big or small decisions that people have to make throughout their lives. So all the way from, I have a choice of airlines, which airline should I take to fly to Perugia? Or my kid is going to university, what university should they consider? And the idea is that if we do this well, then these become reliable, evergreen resources that people would return to, they would recommend to their friends, and therefore we build habit and loyalty. Audience voices is really interesting in a way that is not a standalone product like rankings and newsletters is, but it's a hypothesis that the more that we foster a dialogue and the more that we foster a two-way conversation between journalists and readers, the more that they can feel involved in our journalism, then the more loyal and habit building that will be. And so I have lots of really, really talented colleagues focus on the other sort of side of growth, which is reach, and how do we just get in front of more and more people. But a lot of the work that I'm doing now and the teams that I am involved in have to do with after we reach these people, how do we help build a habit and build a sense of loyalty amongst them?
I mean, you raise a really interesting issue. Oh, sorry, you raised a really interesting issue there, which is, I mean, you've all got growth either as a kind of explicit or kind of lurking goal. How clearly how clearly articulated are your growth goals? Do you have growth goals, and are they clear? So, Robin, picking up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we absolutely. So we have a sense of what we want to achieve. So unfortunately, I can't sort of divulge the exact details of like we want to hit this number.
But you have hard numbers.
But so yes, but I want to qualify sort of your question by saying that, for me personally, at least, I look at growth in several dimensions. So one of them is the hard numbers question of just purely, let's just say audience. Is the newsletter audience growing? You know, like at what rate is it growing? Can we hit a certain number of audience? But for these teams, growth is also the maturity of the team and our capability. Are we able to start doing some experimentation within newsletters where we weren't able to before? Is our understanding of our newsletter audience better than it was before? I hired a bunch of the team members fairly recently, so are they gelling? Are they working together? Is the team growing? Are people advancing? So I think I look at my role as balancing these different aspects of growth. Yeah.
Right. And Chris, you got this beautiful tool, Ofan. Do you communicate growth goals, targets?
No. We don't have any explicit targets in the newsroom around that. And I remember when I first started as audience editor, originally SEO editor in, 2009. I remember just thinking, nobody set me a target. You know, what's going on? That's clearly mad, right? I don't have a target. I must have a target.
What's measured gets done, blah, blah,
yeah,
blah.
And somebody upstairs must know what that target is, right? Somebody must, you know. But one of the first things you learn as an audience editor, right? Anybody in this room who's worked with audience data in a news environment, you know that you're in control of the numbers and of growth in the same way that an astronaut is in control of the rocket that blasts them off the launch pad, right? yeah, you can optimize and you can pitch and yaw a little bit, but fundamentally you are strapped to a rocket, and that rocket is the news cycle. And it's also the content you create in response to the news cycle. And of course, the other side of that coin is if you do try and force the issue, i.e., if your role as an audience team is to identify topics that your journalists must cover because you know that that will generate page views, you're running dangerously close into undermining the whole point of what you're doing. So we talk at The Guardian about responsible reach, right? Every single piece of journalism that we produce, we should care about. It should hit a certain level of quality, and we believe it does. And we want to find the widest, most relevant and engaged audience for that piece. We want to do everything we can to try and give it the best shot at finding something. And even then, the other aspect of audience work, as all of us on this panel know, is you're not operating in a vacuum, right? You're competing against other people and on quite bloody battlegrounds like Google search. So sometimes, even if you do everything right, you don't win, right? And that's another aspect of it. So all of the best audience editors I know start from the position of real humility about just how much they're in control of things. And that also then speaks to why we don't have targets, because it's nuts, right?
So you don't secretly want a number? Wouldn't make your life easier?
No, but what we do every single day, and I think this is really important, lots of people have taken a similar idea to OFAN and developed their own bespoke tool, but one thing that is often not copied is the first thing that I did when I became audience editor, which is we write a daily email that goes out to pretty much the whole organization, which does include numbers, but more importantly, it has a written through narrative about what the day before looked like. And again, every single number when you're talking about the news can only make sense when you're talking about the context of the news cycle. So its main job is to kind of say, okay, it was Ukraine yesterday, and obviously COVID is still running. We hit this kind of level of reach, and that was good, or perhaps we missed a couple of things here or there. But it's that nuance that I want to inject into this situation, and that's the reason why I fear targets. They're necessary, and especially for all of those teams who are attempting to generate revenue off the back of what you're doing, but they have to be handled with extreme care.
Yeah. Hi, Renée. Great to have you here.
I thought I'd come.
We're just going to close up this question, then I'll formally introduce, give you time to settle down. I mean, okay, so you don't have targets, and the kind of subtext of what you're saying is you need elaborate care and love in terms of how you introduce any kind of, basically respect the culture massively.
Yeah, with any number.
With any number.
Well, and one of the things that frustrates me sometimes about growth and audience conversations on Twitter is often people talk about good or bad metrics, right? And usually, page views is a bad metric and engagement is a good metric, and it's a nonsense. Anybody who's looked at what's happened to Facebook over the last few years knows how badly wrong optimizing to engagement and nothing else can go. Equally, page views, if they're used right, are unbelievably important for a multitude of reasons, especially if you want to find a wide audience.
Great. Well, I'm going to pick up the culture issue with you in a sec, but I just want to introduce Renée. Renée, do you want to explain who you are, what you do, and you have actually the most complex growth mandate on this panel. So if you can explain what growth means for you and your role.
I'm quite sure that actually the challenge with growth is that it's complex for everyone. That said, I do look after growth across a lot of different verticals, but I am the head of digital editorial development for the Financial Times, which probably like any number of our titles means absolutely nothing until you sort of fill the empty container that we probably all invented for ourselves. And so I look after much of the digital journalism that was never traditionally text, which obviously is the traditional kind of format for the Financial Times. So I look after newsletters and all of our podcasts and other audio, our topic hubs, which increasingly are ways of accessing and distributing content that many of you in new formats are creating. And then across all of that, from within the newsroom, I look after a lot of the monetization strategies and experimenting with different ways to monetize. So yeah, growth means a very different thing actually than it used to look. Did you want me to talk about what growth means for us? Yeah, sorry. So in thinking about growth, it used to be not that long ago that growth was subscribers when it came to our business model, or revenue, hence audience when it came to other business models, right? Because it was sort of very much a traffic-driven model. And now actually growth is a lot more complex because it really means, I think, stabilizing and securing what you have in terms of an audience and revenue, while also thinking about how to perpetually be adding to that revenue. So we can no longer just, for example, at the Financial Times, think about subscribers. We have to think about subscribers and reach. And in general, though, I think when we think about growth, we have to be agreed within the business what growth is, because otherwise there's a real challenge in just getting any kind of alignment and investment from within the company about what growth is. So so to sum up, not so quickly, growth right now for us is an actual combination of retention and reach, and different products for different kinds of growth.
Yeah, because I mean, I think we're into the kind of the second era of growth, and I think something that's hitting you and hitting Robin very much is growth is contingent on getting different bits, independent bits of the internal organization to work together. And then I think for people like you with senior growth roles, the challenge becomes actually leading areas that you have no conventional leadership authority over. So it becomes a kind of much more complex leadership task, in addition to the issues around setting metrics and managing culture. I mean, would you two like to talk about that? Because I picked that up also very clearly with the New York Times, with their growth, this pod development. I don't know if you come across this pod idea. It's a bit analogous to the vertical. So the pod is where you bring together non-journalism facing parts of the business to work together for like 2-3 years to meet a specific goal. But the challenge around that is these are separate divisions who have to collaborate. It's very tricky to do.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm sure actually others have views on that. Gosh, I would imagine actually, Robin, from the perspective of the Wall Street Journal, and I think it's probably actually quite typical, and maybe actually Reuters or The Guardian, typical of organizations that are a bit larger, where we have mandates to do something which isn't traditionally about acquisition or traffic, which were the traditional ways that you sustained a business. It is about maybe loyalty, that can be growth for some businesses, or other things. In any case, we are trying to create new strategies, whether through content or internal behaviors, the integration of data into the newsroom, the integration of the question of metrics or impact into our content and our journalism. All of those things didn't used to happen 5 years ago or 5 minutes ago, and it's not really anyone's job, but it needs to be everyone's mandate to get it to work. So it is a job of tremendous just influence, relationship building internally, and a lot of pretty basic, at least from my perspective, kind of primal, trying to understand how to get people to do what you want them to do, and so what's in it for them, and trying to translate a kind of new strategy or a new way of working or a new objective, whether that's reaching an audience we never used to reach, or participating in podcasts, or being comfortable with a partnership structure to produce a new kind of content that we never did before in the newsroom. And it's not anybody's job, per se. We don't have the authority to do that. But it is about persuading people that it's in their best interest possibly to give it a try and make it work or not. And if it works, then other people begin to pay attention, and there's buy-in.
How does this play out for you, Yasir? I mean, you're a non-profit, so I would imagine you've got a super thick culture. So, yeah.
Super. My previous... Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting to it. Sorry. The culture is super thick for us. And these are folks who've been in the newswire business for a very, very long time. But even before here, I worked at Euronews, and before that at Al Jazeera. And there was so much sort of education, basically imparting data literacy required to sometimes a reluctant, sometimes a resistant stakeholder, that setting any targets for these folks would have been completely useless, because what are we, how I grappled with the idea of how am I going to be able to set targets for a newsroom that doesn't even believe in this or doesn't know how this works. But also there was a flip side to it, which was dangerous, which is when we first started talking about numbers when we were at Al Jazeera, it became this toxic competition between teams where every Thursday there was the big programs meeting, and a different program editor would come to me every few minutes and say, what are my numbers this week? I need to know my numbers so I can talk about it at the meeting. And it became so toxic that my sort of rebellion against it was I created this internal analytics tool called the Tool for Web Analytics Tracking. You can work out the acronym. That I would circulate to all the programs producers to just check out their own numbers if they wanted to, because I was just sick of it. In a newsroom like TRF, I've resisted the urge to set targets, because right now my task is to impart, is to work with these folks to agree on what success for us looks like before we start saying, well, okay, we would need a 20% growth in X and 40% growth in Y. I mean, what we are starting at is, you guys work really hard to do the work that you do. Here's somebody who can help us make sure that as many people as possible read that work or watch that work, right? That's where we're at. Once that is understood, then we can move on to the next step. We're bringing in a tool called Sophie, which is a AI-powered tool that was developed by the Globe and Mail, and you can weight different things differently in Sophie. And so I have worked out we've just hired a global head of audience, and we've been working out how are we going to weight things in different years. So year one, we need to get people in the door, right? So we're going to, give a bigger weight to page views, but we're going to phase those out. And by year three, we would like to have, time spent on page and return visits as our chief metric. But, that is where we're at as a traditionally newswire-focused not-for-profit. But this mantra I always repeat in newsrooms, and which I've spoken to you about, is, there's 3 billion people on the internet. I just want 100 million. That's all I want. And so if I'm setting myself a target, that's what I'm setting myself, like 100 million loyal users who come and spend 5 minutes per article and move on to another article that is one of ours. That is, if it's an amorphous target, but it is something that I would like us to achieve in about 3 years. Right. That is the basic level that we're starting at, because right now it's about literacy, it's about making people in the newsroom care about what we're doing and how we would like, how we'd like to build readership of our work. That's a basic premise.
I mean, I've got two questions, a couple of questions picking off building off what you've all said. The firstly is presumably right at the top of the organisation, there are quite hard, ambitious goals. Sorry, yeah? Oh, I need to lean towards it, thank you. Yeah, at the top of the organisation, there actually are quite tough ambitions about goals. So how do you communicate the subtleties and the challenge up, actually? Because I'm sure it's easier for them to say, look, that's the target, how long is it going to take, what do you need? And the second thing is, if the culture is so sensitive, really tips, is there vocabulary to avoid, are there terms to avoid? Is there a subtle way of doing it? So I guess it's communicating up. How do you communicate the sophistication and complexity up? And how do you manage the messaging internally?
I'm hard on a few things. It's on now. I'm hard on a few things. There's certain things that you're just supposed to know because the internet has existed since 1995, and if you have no business being in the business if you don't know about it. For instance, I've banned the word clickbait at our meetings because you don't know what you're talking about when you say, well, give it a clickbaity headline. What does that even mean, right? It's become this really useless jargon that people seem to throw around, and it irritates the hell out of me. So I've banned certain things. I remember a few weeks ago, one senior person asked me, well, is that what we're after now? Are we after clicks? And my answer was, that would have been a really smart question in 2002, but we are in 2022 now, and it's no longer a smart question. We should know that behind most clicks, not all, behind most clicks is a human being who's decided to give you 2 minutes of their time that they're never going to get back. So, no, we're not after clicks, we're after human attention. And so, again, when it comes to traditional newsrooms, this is the level of understanding that we're starting at. And so, if I were to say to them, we are aiming for an audience retention of 20% in the next X number of months or X number of years, that would be like, right? So yeah, first I need to make them care. And,
Right.
yeah, that's where, yeah.
So I actually think that sometimes having a really clear goal from the top about what we want to achieve is very clarifying and actually very clarifying and very unifying. I suppose communicating in nuance, to answer Lucy's questions about communicating in nuance, is able to sort of paint the picture of what the journey looks like, and to say that, we are working towards this big organizational goal, but here's how we're going to do it, or we are going to do it in this way in order to be sensitive to certain things, or in order to stay within certain guardrails and all of that. And then in terms of communicating across the newsroom to others, I think there's a large part of listening, because so despite my job title, New Formats Editor, none of the free teams that I'm in charge of are particularly newsletters have been around for forever, rankings have been around for forever, so none of them are new, and I'm not coming into this with a blank slate, and so being able to talk to people and understand sort of how they got to where they are, what were their original motivations of creating this newsletter, showing a willingness to listen helps. And then I suppose the last sort of bit of, I guess, advice or tip would be, what is a way of phrasing it that speaks to their motivations as a result? So we might be interested in figuring out ways to increase click-throughs from newsletters to articles, or increase reach of newsletters, but maybe don't describe it in that way, and maybe talk to a newsletter writer about how, we think that the newsletters is a really great way to get more people to come to your column and to read your column, and that's something that's motivating for them personally, and sometimes it's just a matter of phrasing
Right.
and of framing.
Right.
Yeah.
Renée?
To add to that, which I think is a really good point, and also to add to something Chris was saying earlier, one of the challenges also, whether it's up, sideways, or down in terms of getting buy-in, is trying to find ways to make people understand that it's worth it, even in terms of the investment, not just of their time, but maybe their team's time. Maybe it's not them directly. Maybe it's resource you need from them. And on the one hand, once you've done the hard work of agreeing to some metrics that measure the real value of what we're getting, it could be conversions if subscription is your business, or loyalty if something else is. But oftentimes when you are experimenting with new ways to find growth or looking for growth elsewhere, you aren't really able to measure it exactly. Is it worth our time? Do we know if it's getting value? It's a little bit finger in the wind. You have to be maybe willing to take a risk, or see how it goes, and then figure out what the value is. And it can be very difficult, especially in today's context globally, and the risk and the complexity of running a viable media business, to be able to convince people, especially that way, to take a risk, or to convince people within a business whose resource allocation is really tough, and maybe they have a target or an objective in product or in tech or in marketing to reach X number of acquisitions or X number of prospects. And you just want to try something that's never been tried before, and you don't know how to measure it. And it might be the next thing that might be really helpful, but yeah, that can be really difficult, is just understanding, okay, how do we take a risk? How do we grow growth? And that risk-taking, even in very big organizations where you might feel secure in your kind of financial foundations, is very hard, and maybe even harder in traditional organizations.
Do you guys have like a lab set up at the FT where you can take those risks in a controlled environment before you sort of ask a department to take it, or is the approach going to a team saying, let's take this risk?
That lab used to exist.
Oh, right. Okay.
The lab was demolished?
Well, so it was a very interesting kind of lab in the early days of innovation. And the early days of innovation were like 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. It was called FT Labs, and it was very blue sky thinking. So it wasn't, in fact, it was precisely not necessarily looking to achieve a commercial outcome, and that was scrapped. Because for a while, we really doubled down on commercial outcomes. And I think the interesting place about where the Financial Times is now, and maybe many of those sort of more legacy businesses, is as you undoubtedly said in your introduction that I missed, Lucy, probably was something about the fact that we're now in a different phase to some extent of the development of businesses, and it's a different phase even of growth, right? Where like we've all integrated a certain amount of innovations, whether it was data and analytics and growth even as a concept editorially, and now it's a different phase, and I think that's where the complexity arises.
I think for us, the advantage as a not-for-profit newsroom is that we can afford to not look at the commercial outcomes, and we're expected to spend all the money we get in that bucket, which is a really good spot to be in. And so, like I said, I'm new in the job, and one of the conditions of my signing the contract was that I wanted to eventually create a bit of a lab culture where we not only experiment with content, but we experiment with growth strategies and workshop things and simulate scenarios and come up with solutions too. And I actually think that some of the solutions to market problems might come from not-for-profits like ours, where we can afford to take bigger risks with our money than commercial operations can. Commercial operations obviously have a lot more money than we do, but a lot of it is, profit, et cetera, and the expenditure is a lot more stringent. But yeah, this is, like I said, my first nonprofit job, but I think nonprofit newsrooms can probably be a big force when it comes to working out strategies.
I wanted to circle around to something Renée said. I mean, in terms of what your biggest lever for growth is.
Lean into the mic.
Oh, sorry. I think the biggest lever for growth is convincing everybody in the newsroom that attending to the metrics in a responsible way is part of their job. Right? It's not good enough to build an audience function and then say that's their job. And so our audience team is about communicating culture and arguing the case for why these things should matter to editors and journalists. And actually, that argument shouldn't be too tough, right? Talking about words that might be banned, the one I want to see the back of is Vanity Metrics. Now, it will depend on your model, and all of us here.
Give us an example of a vanity metric.
Well, people will say that a page view or even time spent on page is a vanity metric because, it's the journalist, disappearing up their own behind. And, the interesting thing about that is, right, especially in an open model like The Guardian's, we want people to read our journalism, right? We do want that and to stay with it. And that's part of journalism. It's the act of journalism. And there should be a really strong vocal argument for what the audience team do and what they try to encourage the newsroom to do to be the completion of the act of journalism. After you press publish, what happens then? And there are various simple levers around that, right, which you can have immense impact with. Change a headline. People aren't clicking on it. Look at why. Mix it up. Ask a few questions about whether you're describing it accurately. You can affect attention time in that way as well. And so that's another thing that's really interesting to me about growth, right? There's a lot of talk about what levers do you have, and there's lots of people who talk openly about we're going to target this, we're going to grow an audience in this particular area. And actually, the levers at most people's disposal are quite limited. And I'm always surprised, I always worry that I've missed a trick. But often, the ways in which people attempt to grow these audiences are really quite basic, right? And those are the best. Write some journalism that actually relates to the audience you're trying to find and make sure that it's discoverable. Quite simple, probably the best way of doing it. But yeah, I really, really think it's important. If the whole newsroom doesn't think that it's their job, you have a problem. And the other thing that I really want to emphasize is if you're asking them to take responsibility, you have immense responsibility for the way in which you build that culture. Right? You have to protect them. OFAN is open to every single person at The Guardian with a Guardian email address. How does it feel if you spend time in good faith writing an article and you get a terrible attention time and you know that everyone can see that? It's rough. So you have to develop ways of talking carefully about when things don't go quite right. You have to be clear about the fact that it's impossible to actually commission a piece and guarantee it's going to get a really high attention time. Because, you know, sometimes it just doesn't work that way, right? So take care of the people you're communicating to.
How is that really going? You've got people who are massively intrinsically motivated. They care about what they're doing and they get rubbish figures. I mean, because it's not really scalable, the volume of journalism the Guardian's doing. You're talking about a very careful, thoughtful, considerate approach. I mean, and then on the other hand, people are kind of automizing and using AI tools. I mean, how do you square the circle?
I mean, in terms of supporting people, that morning email is crucial, but also the way in which we talk to people directly about pieces all of the time. All of the time. You know, if you know, different topics will guarantee you different results, right? 500,000 page views on a piece about Kim Kardashian, that's all right. 30,000 page views on a piece about social work in Lewisham, that might actually be a 5-star result. And you have to talk about things like that. That's also why we don't have, for example, in OFAN anywhere, any way in which people can pull up a list of the highest page views by author across The Guardian. We could do it really easily, right? It's simple to create, but we rip that out intentionally and we don't provide it because we want OFAN not to feel like a weapon. And everybody in the newsroom, at that moment when it feels like a weapon, it's a nightmare. And the other crucial thing is, if you're not looking at what's not working, that's where all the learning is, and you again have a problem. So you have to build really careful ways of talking about things not working out. That is hard, and we get that wrong all the time, and I'm sure everybody on the panel does. But you have to try really consciously to do it.
Yeah, because I mean, you've got more volume of units going through with, say, Robin and Renée. You've got a number of items you're innovating on. How do you deal with failure or iteration in those? That presumably they're higher ticket. There's more riding on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, sort of I'm approaching each of these teams and each of these sort of, I guess, products not with a blank slate. And so we have a stable and a portfolio of newsletters existing. And so the way that you approach it is not necessarily to say, let's just take our already best performing and most reliable 5 or 10 and change it completely tomorrow. And then if it doesn't work, then that's a huge failure and that's terrible. Is to say that we have a stable of things that kind of work and we want to experiment either with when we create a new newsletter or some of the more specialist audiences around the edges. And so I think it's a little bit about sort of picking your battles and picking where you choose to introduce change and introduce sort of experimentation. And then the next part of it, the way is just, I couch a lot of what we try to do as hypotheses. So we are doing this because we have a hypothesis that if we, I'm gonna make a fake example here, change the way that the subject line in the emails are written, then more people will open it and click through. And so when we do something like that, we always communicate sort of like, what is our hypothesis? What is the sort of period of time that we're testing it for? And then that allows us very easily, 3 months later, to say, we had thought that doing this would produce this result, and it didn't. And here are some hypotheses or some reasons why it might not have. And then you can do a new experiment to see how you can change that. And I think sort of the idea that every sort of change or every experiment that you do ends up creating insights and learnings that allow you to ask the next question and the next question and the next question means that you can do a lot of learning and consolidate a lot of your learning before you then apply it to across-the-board changes or to changes in some of your sort of bigger ticket items.
Can I just add a sort of sidebar to that? And that is that so far, traditional legacy newsrooms see things in terms of problems and solutions. There's not a lot of let's try things and we'll learn from them even if we fail type of a mindset. So what happens when the audience team goes to editorial and says, we're going to try this thing. And the question is always, is that going to get us more viewership? Well, we don't know. well, you'll try it, and sometimes it'll fail, or you won't get the expected result, and then it'll be like, aha, you guys don't know what you're doing, right? So there's that, and the job for somebody like me becomes, no, failure is good. We're learning from this, but we don't come, especially legacy newsrooms, don't come with a culture of experimentation and learning from failure. So I think audience teams have a huge challenge ahead of them where they're also just sort of fearing the experiment not working out and being branded as, you guys don't know what the hell you're doing, right? Does that happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to competition, right? And all of the other factors that you're not in control of.
Yeah. But again, these are newsrooms that are used to being in control of pretty much everything. And then all of a sudden now there's control of almost nothing, which is a really hard pill to swallow.
Yeah. Renée, did you want to jump in there?
Yes, I think you make a really good point about how a culture of learning from failure is not comfortable in traditional newsrooms, i.e. it's okay to fail because you learn something and learnings count, learnings have value. And what I found at the FT, interestingly, and this is probably the case with most larger organizations, is that I almost want to say sort of unfortunately, but that's a value judgment, that in order for that to work, there has to be top-down buy-in. And if the boss says, we're trying this thing, we don't really know if it's going to work or not, we're launching this new show or a new podcast, or we're experimenting with a new format, or when it comes to the broader Financial Times right now, we've just launched a new app called the FT Edit. And for the first time ever, the CEO has officially communicated to the business that this is just an experiment. It might not work, but we're going to learn a lot. It seems like a very simple, basic way to think about innovation. It is a radical change for a for-profit business. And there's also even a more fundamental newsroom problem, which is if it's just to experiment, newsrooms are busy. Journalists are up against it. They've got stories to write. Like right now, for the past 2 years, election cycles before that, yeah, experimenting is fine, but it's not their job. And they might have a personal appetite for it, in which case you're lucky. But if there's top-down buy-in of like, this is a thing we're doing and it's important, that's going to put it on their radar. It's a human instinct thing. Or finally, the way around that is in some ways, and I think you're absolutely right, yes, it's fascinating as an idea of like, oh, actually could not-for-profits be incubators? Wow, that's a really interesting idea. I haven't thought about that. Because the only other way around a sort of preconceived sort of apprehension around the risks of experimenting without results is if you just carve out your own pockets within the newsroom to do it. So I've done that at the Financial Times, where I was running audio, which was just traditionally podcast, but I was able to find a partner, Microsoft, who came in briefly to finance an audio lab. And so I was able to experiment with new digital voice technologies and automated news digest and automated newsletters, and it was entirely off the radar. And I kept on having to remind the editor-in-chief, hey, we're doing this thing, and it's actually kind of working. And she's like, right, wow, that's interesting. And who are you doing it with again? And along the way, we'll have learned a tremendous amount. As it happens, it was quite laborious because it was all over here and wasn't really part of my job, and I had to bring in teams to do it. So we actually just concluded the experiment, which lasted a year, but my God, did we learn a lot. And at some point, when finally it comes around for sophisticated automated voices to be useful in newsrooms, and that's going to happen very quickly, oh, here's the thing, we know how to use them. Isn't that cool? But sometimes you can't rush it.
Yeah, you had a great phrase when we were talking about this before, which is like the people at the top say, we've brought in these people, why the hell can't they Harry Potter it?
Yeah.
Which I think is a phrase to be saved forever. But.
Yeah, the internet is expected to be magic, right? Because you don't see how it's executed in the back end, and especially, folks above you haven't had the time to to figure that out. So, one of the things I always tell media bosses when they hire me is, don't expect me to Harry Potter your newsroom in about 7 months, because I'm not going to magically make 10, 20 years of bad habits, or not bad habits, but habits that are not relevant now. Disappear overnight. But that is the expectation. I remember at my last job, the CEO took me out to lunch and said, I want you to start a revolution. I thought, I'm not going to last very long in this job, because that's not what I do. To Renee's point, I think top-down buy-in of not only a culture of experimentation, but also a culture of patience and trial and error and failure and learning, and just repeating this cycle until things are learned from it. And constant adaptation is so necessary. At Euronews, I remember the head of the Italian language service came to me at one point, and she'd been a journalist for 50 years. She'd been making television for, I guess 50 years. Is that how long TV's been around? I can't even remember. But she said, well, how long will it take before we learn everything there is to learn about digital, and we can do our jobs? And I realized that in that moment that we hadn't changed the way we make television in about 50 years. The technology might have evolved, but the formula has not evolved. I mean, you still do the exact same thing that you did in the 1960s. And I said to her, actually never. We were never going to know enough, and that is the best part. You get to come in every day, and you get to try something, you get to fail, you get to learn, you get to come in tomorrow, you get to do it again. And every day you get to learn something new, and her jaw was on the floor, because that in itself was such a radically different way of thinking.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, TV journalism is almost clerical now, right? Like, you do a clerical job. It's almost a bureaucrat's job. And so is newspaper journalism in the most traditional sense. So yeah, if you are a boss who is sitting out there, don't expect your growth people to Harry Potter you an audience, because that shouldn't happen. And if they're telling you that they are doing it, then they're absolute charlatans. And there's a lot of charlatanry in this business that blew my mind. At one point, I called my old TV boss and I said, can you give me my TV job back? Because I don't want to deal with charlatans anymore. Because, there was one company where I was reading an article and there was a flicker, and I called up the tech and I said, did you put auto refresh on the website? And it was, sure enough, there was an auto refresh every 15 seconds, counted it as an extra page view. And I was the bastard who killed it. And they came after me saying, you killed our page view count. And I was like, well, your advertisers are way too smart. At some point they would ask you. And there's stuff like that I can do. I can totally do that tomorrow and give you growth. But people who give you money are becoming smarter and smarter by the day, and they will ask you, hey, how come you had 300 people last month, now you have 3,000 people? What did you do, and can you replicate that? And then therein, your explanation will give you away, or your lack of explanation. So yeah, this is not magic. Don't you dare go back to your newsrooms and expect to implement magic.
But I mean, this is an industry that tends to move in swarms. An idea takes root, and everyone's following the same kind of recipe, which is good or bad. Do you think there's kind of going to be a common lever that people are going to be pulling in the next 2-3 years to find the growth? To build off the corona growth, or to compensate for what may have churned off right now. I mean, do you feel there's going to what's going to be the top of the hit list in terms of growth levers?
So I have an answer that's maybe a little bit unconventional, and this goes off of what Yasir was saying a little bit earlier about learning and adapting rather than the charlatanery. But I think one of the most satisfying aspects of growth for me in my job is the growth of my team and the people that I work with, and so the ability to take someone who was perhaps in a very traditional reporting editing role and make them a great manager and a great leader of people, and for them to sort of learn about what's happening in product and learn about what's happening in sort of the business side and how we can all work together to create these things is, first of all, personally satisfying for me, but I feel like is also the answer to your question, Lucy, which is like, I feel like that is probably the biggest and most common lever for continued growth, which is if you are an organization that can continually upskill, train up, or whatever sort of word you want to use, your people.
So that's the unlock.
Yeah.
Anyone else? The big unlock?
I think there's something interesting about targeting audiences and trying to build something for them. And it's quite difficult. You know, I've been talking to various people here about Semaphore targeting 200 million underserved college-educated people in the world. English speaking, yes, for example. I mean, one good example of that, I would say, is Guardian Australia, right? And Guardian Australia worked because we were very lucky to have philanthropy backing it at the beginning, but the main reason it worked is because there was a gap in that market. A really clear gap that the Guardian fitted into really beautifully. And I think that's the starting point, right? Where is the actual underserved audience? Are you the right answer to it? And then what are you going to build as journalism, first and foremost, to meet that demand? If you get that right to start with, all of the optimization stuff and all of the growth levers that we're talking about should naturally really, really grow you out in the same way as has happened with Guardian Australia. But also, just be clear about how much resource that may take, and be clear about whether you're trying to be a primary brand. Are you going to be the people who they come to first? Or are you a secondary brand or a tertiary kind of visit? Those things really change the way you need to think about what you're building and what it looks like as an editorial organization before you get to the growth.
Right. Renee?
Yeah, I do think actually, and it's a little bit related to what you were saying, Chris. There's one thing probably everyone's going to be doing that maybe they weren't doing before, and it's something that probably ought to make the ears of anybody who works in audience sort of ring and sing, which is I think everyone, no matter how you're defining growth or whatever your business model is, everyone now is going to focus on building relationships with an audience. And that wasn't a given before. A lot of it in a previous sort of first phase of digital was traffic, and then a lot of it was just a focus on a commercial outcome, which was subscriptions, if you wanted to get people to pay, or a lot of it was, simply trying to reach an audience. And now, no matter what your objective, there is a sense, whether it's because you have to grow trust, whether it's because you have to grow loyalty, whether it's because you have to grow return traffic, whether it's because you have to grow relevance or differentiation, or whether you have to grow a better user experience in order to compete with, but that building of relationships, which is something that seems so not journalistic, even just 5 or 6 years ago, or 6 or 7 years ago, when some of us had the first sort of audience roles, I think that's now absolutely built in across the board. Everyone's converted and everyone needs to do it, is my theory.
I think I've got two levers. One external, one internal. Two external, two internal. The external ones are, I've always said this, consistently good content. I think is key. There's a lot of. Sorry, can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. Good content will transcend any algorithm, I think. And I've always said this from when I didn't even know what an algorithm was. And I used to say, make good stuff, people will watch it. Add to, start interesting conversations or add to existing conversations in a meaningful way, and do it consistently, and you'll make a space for yourself. So I think externally, there's that. The other non-negotiable externally is community management. Building communities around your work, around your niches, and maintaining that contact, that back and forth with those audience communities. I think news orgs need to invest in that, because that's a huge source of growth. Internally, it is adaptation and education. I think internally, constantly upskilling your teams, looking after them, educating them on, and developing that culture of experimentation and learning from your failures. I've worked in newsrooms where people were afraid to make mistakes, and I would get 18 emails a day on one task. I'd ask somebody to just, find a video, get it cleared for use on our platforms, and I have 18 emails. And eventually I said, man, you're 42 years old. You know how to do this. Just don't get me sued. And I think that's all that was needed to, and they were like, well, what if I do something wrong? Of course you're going to do something wrong. This is the first time you're doing it. If you're doing it the 5th time, then I will come talk to you about it. But this is the first time, and so I'm totally expecting you to get it wrong. And I think that sort of level of, I've got your back with your teams, plus constant sort of encouragement to adapt and upskill and making those resources available internally is probably the internal lever to do it.
We've got about 2 minutes for questions. Any burning questions from the audience you'd like to?
Oh, we don't.
We don't? No time for, okay. After that. Thank you, Renée.
Thank you, everybody.
Robin, Yasir. You're welcome. Sorry.
Thanks, Liz.
How do you suppose that went? Did that go all right? Is that how you wanted it to go?
I think so.